Hello and welcome back to the Canadian Money Roadmap Podcast. I'm your host, Evan Neufeld. Today's episode is a very special one. We've made it to 100 episodes, and to mark the occasion, today I'm joined by a very special guest, Dr. Daniel Crosby. He is a psychologist and behavioral finance expert, and he wrote a book called The Laws of Wealth that I read recently, and I think it is probably one of the best books on investing and becoming a better investor that I've ever read. So I thought I would reach out to Daniel and see if he wanted to share some wisdom from the book to you and to me as well. I love bringing on guests that I can learn from at the same time. So along with this great episode, I have 10 copies of The Laws of Wealth available to you as the listener. And if you just go to the link in the show notes below, you can fill out a survey to tell me a little bit more about yourself and what you like about the podcast. And for anyone that fills out the survey, I'll put you in a draw to get one of 10 copies of The Laws of Wealth. So without too much more rambling here, it's a great conversation coming up about all things how to be a better investor and how to understand our behavior as it relates to our money. Here's my conversation with Dr. Daniel Crosby. Dr. Daniel Crosby, thank you so much for joining me today on the Canadian Money Roadmap Podcast.
Evan, good to be with you, sir.
Awesome. Thanks, Daniel. Okay, so as we were talking about before we started recording here, recently stumbled on your book, The Laws of Wealth, which is one of a few books that you've written, and I've started seeing you then online and finding your podcast. You focus on something called behavioral finance. Can you tell me a little bit about your background and what behavioral finance is and how that maybe that differs from traditional dollars and cents finance?
Yeah, no, happy to. So I am a clinical psychologist by education, right? Which will be a little bit surprising to some folks that someone like me would be working on Wall Street effectively, right? In the world of money. But what happened is I went to school to be a psychotherapist, right? I went to school, I wanted to work with people with eating disorders. And about halfway through my doctoral training, I just frankly burned out. I was, seeing a lot of clients. I was all of 23 years old when I started, which is a great time to give life advice, I think, because you've got it all figured out. But, I was young. I was young when I started my doctoral training. I burned out. I just had bad boundaries. I was taking work home with me. And I loved thinking about why people did the things they did. I mean, that's sort of my only hobby really is reading about psychology. But I knew that I didn't want to do it in a medical setting. And so I came to my father, who is himself a financial advisor. And I said to him, look, Dad, I'm, 25 years old. I'm already fried on this profession that I'm halfway through a PhD in. I had a full scholarship. And I'm like, I love figuring people out, but I don't want to do it in this setting. And he said, well, hey, there's a ton of psychology in my work. Now, that shocked my 25-year-old mind because I had always conceptualized of my dad as sort of one part stock picker and one part sales guy. And I was surprised to hear him say that there was so much psychology in his work. But that sort of simple comment by my dad put me on a path to explore what we now know as behavioral finance and behavioral economics. My dad certainly didn't have the language to call it that at the time. But behavioral finance is just finance that accounts for the messiness of human nature. Because traditional economic models are built on this presupposition that people maximize utility or sort of maximize positive outcomes. And I mean, I think a quick look at your bank statement for the month tells any of us that that's not always the case, that we sort of don't always make optimized, fully rational decisions with our money. And so behavioral finance, my field, is just sort of the psychology of money, the psychology of investment decision-making in particular is kind of where I hang out. But yeah, that's just the messy part of money, the human part of money is my discipline.
Maybe this question is too big then from there, but when it comes to money and you describe it as the messiness of money, why does our behavior skew to the messy as opposed to making things better and optimized? Like, why do we want that and can't do it? Whereas our behavior goes the opposite way.
Yeah. So this is the clinical psychologist in me talking, but I think human behavior is messy broadly. Like, I don't think money is the only place where we make dumb choices, but it certainly is maybe the biggest place. So we're here today talking about the laws of wealth, but I've written a couple of other books as you noted. And in one of my books, my most recent book, the Behavioral Investor, I did some research and I found fMRI studies, so brain scans, right? So they would hook people up to a brain scan and they would have all sorts of sort of fraught conversations with them. So they would ask them about, all the good stuff, sex, politics, religion, death, like sort of all the hot button issues. And money was among these. And they found that money had more excitatory power in the brain than even something like sex or death or politics or religion. And that's why we get messy, because we've wrapped so much up in money. Like, it's almost like liquid happiness is how we conceptualize it, right? It's this marker of status. It's a marker of success and achievement. We tightly conflate it with things like happiness and having lived a good life. And I mean, look, all of those things are kind of true and kind of problematic, and we could certainly get into that. But we ask money to do a lot, I think, and have a lot riding on it. And I think that's one reason it gets messy. The other the sort of most obvious reason that it gets messy is there's a degree to which you just die if you don't have, you don't have enough money, right? I mean, there's this biological imperative to have enough money to live sort of a basic life. Then beyond that, we sort of put all this psychological weight on it. And then the other reason, sort of a third reason is we're all sort of this N of one when it comes to our money story. The way that you grew up, the time and place and parents that you grew up with versus the time and place and parents that I grew up with. We learn all of these different money stories, and then we live and work and play and marry people who have different money stories, who are also an N of one that's different than ours. And so like our money realities are also bumping up against sort of 7 billion other money realities. And I think that's an inherently messy process.
Which makes marriage and markets and everything else very, very unique when it comes to managing things for ourselves. So, okay, so we've talked about the messiness side of things, but that's not why I liked your book, and I have appreciated your approach, because this is not to discredit any of the names I'm going to drop here, but, Richard Thaler, his book, if it's not on this shelf, it's on my other one, his book called Misbehaving, and Daniel Kahneman, his whole book, Thinking Fast and Slow. A lot of these ideas are more around identifying problems and identifying and putting a name to the messiness, whereas your book and your approach, it starts there, and like you got to understand where the problems are before you can fix it. But, I'm not a golfer, and so I've taken golf lessons before, and one of the worst lessons I ever had was someone who saw my terrible swing and terrible ball flight and just said, "Oh, don't do that. Don't do that. Don't do that." And so I'm like, just tell me what to do and like point me, like help me here. And so your approach kind of takes that, okay, well, what do we do? So maybe before we get into that a little bit, how useful is problem identifying versus problem solving when it comes to behavioral finance?
Yeah, so I'm glad you noticed that. I hope that's one of the hallmarks of my work is, the growth of behavioral finance and financial psychology has largely mirrored the trajectory of psychology broadly. And if you look at psychology broadly, when Wilhelm Wundt and Sigmund Freud and all these folks were starting out sort of the proper application of psychology, it was all about neuroses, right? I mean, it was all about your mom and your dad and how they broke your brain and, how you're so messed up because of how you grew up and past experiences. It was all pathological, right? And it was not until the 1990s, so like well over 100 years later, into sort of the formal practice of psychology, that you get the positive psychology movement, which is the study of like what makes someone great. What are the pillars of human flourishing? What makes someone a great employee or a great spouse or a great leader? What makes people happy? I mean, that research is 30 years old. And, it's crazy that it took us that long. And when you look at behavioral finance, the same thing happened, right? Like the thing that it took for behavioral finance to achieve sort of escape velocity from the rest of finance was cataloging all of our deviations from rationality. Like, right, these are all the ways that we're not the perfect optimizers that we've been held out to be. And that was sort of a necessary but not sufficient break, right? Like that needed to happen. That's fine. The people you mentioned, I mean, they have Nobel Prizes. I don't. Like they've done incredible.
Yeah, that
work.
was no shade on those gentlemen. Yeah.
They've done incredible work, but I think now it's time to sort of shift, right? Because like you said with your golf lesson, there's now 200-ish ways that we've cataloged that people deviate from rationality when making financial decisions, like 200 different cognitive biases. And like telling someone who is in a sort of a financial quandary, like, hey, look, there's 200 ways you could screw this up, is not a super helpful comment.
And I see 180 that you're doing right now.
Right. You're good. You missed 10 of them.
Yeah,
the rest you got.
Yeah.
No, so I think, the way that I think about these things, and I catalog a handful in my books, is like, get the big rocks right. Like know about these derailers, right? Like know about this handful of sort of psychological tendencies that can derail you. But after that, it's time to focus on what to do and what not, instead of what not to do.
So this is kind of skating around the general idea of risk, I would say. And generally when we talk about investing, the conversation ends up around risk at some level. In my profession, I got to do risk tolerance questionnaires and all that kind of stuff, which is all well and good for sure. But, that revolves around the idea of risk being price changes or volatility. And you would say yes and probably to what risk is. So, what is risk, or what are some risks that you identify here in your book? And is risk something to be accepted or managed?
Yeah. So this is I'm actually writing a book on this right now. So I'm like outlined it yesterday. So I'm not very far in this process, but it's a fascinating topic to me. So when we think about risk, right, you sort of gave a nod there to, here's a big psychology term for you. So operationalization, right? So in finance, we have to operationalize things, which is just a fancy way of saying we have to take sort of an ethereal construct and put some sort of form or substance around it, right? So we've got to come up with some way of quantifying something. And the way that the financial powers that be have gone about operationalizing this concept of risk, which is huge and multifaceted, is they've said, we're going to boil this down to the volatility, sort of the up and down of an asset price. Now, there's a degree to which that is intuitive and true, right? Like nobody loves their stocks to go down, right? Or their account to go down. But I say that it's much bigger than that, because volatility is just sort of a feature of markets. It just sort of is. And, it's interesting to me because I talk about in the book sort of the inevitability of volatility, and try to do that in a way to inoculate investors against sort of the inevitability of it. If we look back in my lifetime, like I'm in my early 40s, if we look back in my lifetime, the average drawdown, right? So the average peak to trough drawdown in any given year is right at about 15%. And so that's what we would quantify as a correction, like a market correction. So on average, in my lifetime, we've had a market correction every single year. And yet the popular media, every time there's a correction, reacts as if it is the most remote, the most outstanding, the most unusual event that has ever occurred. And returns over my lifetime are in the 10 to 11% a year range for the US stock market. And so it's like, look, these things can coexist. You can have really nice returns, and sort of inevitably you're going to have some risk in there. But I tell a story in the book, and it's actually the story of my first client, and I call her Brooke in the book. And, in the book, Brooke, this is my first client. I'm 23 years old. I've never seen a person in therapy before. And this woman comes into my office. She's about my age, young woman, comes into my office and presents me with 6 envelopes. And I'm like, oh God, like, what is this? So she gives me these 6 envelopes and she's like, hey, all my life, ever since I was a little girl, I've wanted to be a doctor. I applied to these medical degree programs to be a doctor. I've heard back from all of them, and I can't bring myself to open the envelope, because what if I open the envelope and I find out that I've been rejected and my dreams are dashed, right? So for like 40 minutes of the 50 minutes, I'm just useless, right? I'm just like stumbling and just kind of upset that I didn't get some like nice garden variety depression or something for my first client. And then finally I say something to the effect of, because I'm thinking about my own experience, and I had just applied to grad school, and I'm thinking about my own experience, and I say, hey, basically like, you've got to open these and let them know if you're coming, right? Like, you've got to open them, like, because if you got in, if you don't open these and say, thanks, I will be attending, you're gonna miss out. And I said, something to the effect of, it seems to me that in the process of trying to manage risk, you're bringing about the inevitability of the very thing you're afraid of. Because if you don't open these, you're afraid of not getting into grad school. Well, guess what? If you don't open these, you're not going to get into grad school. And I analogize that to what investors do, because people are afraid of losing money. They're afraid of not reaching their goals, not keeping up their purchasing power, and not sort of crossing their financial finish line, retiring, living their version of the good life financially. Well, guess what? If you sit on your money, if you don't take appropriate risk, if you keep it in cash, you are not going to cross the financial finish line. You won't. Like, it is almost impossible to maintain a decent standard of living and have your money keep up with inflation if you're not taking some sort of risk. And so, basically for me, sometimes not taking any risk is the biggest risk of all. And I sort of close out the chapter by saying, look, everything worth doing in life is risky. I've got 3 beautiful kids. Like, I lost 3 kids, 3 pregnancies as well, right? Like, having kids, it's a gamble, right? Like, starting a business, it's a gamble. Falling in love is a gamble. Like, anything that's worth doing is risky, and you can own that and bravely move forward, or you can plug your ears and scream about it and find yourself in a very unhappy place, a few decades hence.
Very interesting. I can relate to a lot of that personally. So when it comes to risk management, that's language that I've always been like nervous to use with clients and even on the podcast, because When people that are new to investing or aren't aware of some of these like behavioral topics, perhaps, when they think risk management, that means, okay, risk has happened. I'm doing air quotes because my portfolio is down the 15% that happens every year, or whatever, the correction that happens inevitably. I'm down this much. I'm going to get out of the markets now and manage my risk by not being exposed to further declines. Do you see that in any of your research or studies of how people view risk management? And what's a better way to see investing from a risk management perspective, perhaps practically, if you can?
Yeah, so there's a couple of dimensions of risk management. One is the financial dimension, which would include things like having an appropriate mix of assets and sort of managing your risk that way. That can be accomplished fairly easily with diversification, very easily and very cheaply. If you work with an advisor, read a couple books and do it yourself, like it's not super hard to manage the part of risk that's manageable. But then, again, there's always going to be some unpredictability, right? That's why stocks pay well. But then if you go to the behavioral part, like the personal part of risk, that's what you're talking about. And there's this concept from Howard Marks, who's this legendary investor that I really love, and he calls it the perversity of risk. And so Marx's idea of the perversity of risk is that at the times we feel most self-assured, things are actually quite risky. And at the times we're most fearful, things are actually quite good, or the risk potential is quite low. So one of the things about human nature is that we tend to sort of extrapolate the current moment into the future indefinitely. And so you look at a period like, COVID, like, the COVID lows in March of 2020. It feels like a lifetime ago, but it was just a couple of years ago. But, if you go to that, like if you remember, right, if you put yourself in that spot, I was, like everyone, divorced from the rest of society, walking around my neighborhood, running to the other side of the street when I would see someone else walking, walking around my neighborhood, listening to podcasts that were trying to explain the doom and gloom and like all the death and uncertainty and like trying to figure stuff out. And when you put yourself in that moment, or a March of 2009, another, low in the markets during the great financial crisis, the future looks so bleak, right? And you remember all these articles that were written, like crazy stuff was written, like in the throes of COVID, like people will never shake hands again. Like you're never getting a hug again in your life, buddy. Like, just these sorts of articles were written. And it's this human tendency to just assume that whatever's going on right now is how things are always going to be. But we know that while we think that way, markets move the exact opposite way. Like, I talk in the book about the truest words in investing are "this too shall pass." And so that phrase is so important from a risk management perspective, because in boom times, it should give us pause and give us a dose of humility, right? Like, okay, portfolio's crushing it. It's not always going to be this way. But during the bad times, it should give us heart, right? When you're walking around your neighborhood for exercise and you haven't seen your friends in 6 months or whatever, you know what? It's not always going to be like this. And the markets are not always going to be this bad. So, the biggest risk we can manage is the risk of our own misbehavior. Again, like the sort of getting, risk management from a financial perspective, own a good mix of assets and you're on your way. From a behavioral perspective, it's much thornier. And what we've seen, Evan, this has been studied now by folks like Meyer Statman and others, 19 different countries that they've looked at. the more people mess with their portfolios, the worse they do. And we're learning big words today. It's monotonic, right? It means it's like a stepwise relationship. So if you look at deciles, right? If you take it 10%, the 10% who trade the most versus the 10% who trade the least, it's stair step, the performance. And the more you mess with it in the name of risk management, the worse you tend to do. And it's so difficult because everywhere else in life, if you do more, you get more, right? If you read more books, you get smarter. If you lift more weights, you get stronger, and in markets, if you do nothing, you get the best result. And it's just really weird and really counterintuitive.
I think I saw a study, and maybe this is more a mythological study at this point because I've seen it reported in so many different places, but Fidelity in the US one time reported the demographics of the people that had the best performing accounts, and some of them that were the ones where people have been discovered to be dead. So they had no capacity to trade, and so it's like the ultimate hands-off portfolio. It's like there's no beating heart on the other end of the trading screen, right?
Yeah, so that was first cited in What Works on Wall Street by Jim O'Shaughnessy.
Okay.
I think it's a little apocryphal now. He hasn't been able to like find a like chapter and verse for that. But there is other related research that shows the same thing, right? We know that the less people check their portfolios, the better they tend to do. We know that there's an inverse relationship between things like watching financial news and performance. And so again, it's this very sort of upside down relationship because, in other endeavors, like if you immerse yourself in something and you follow it tick by tick, you're going to tend to be more adept at that thing. And in markets, it's like if you want to be great at this, you literally should step away. Like you should just go do something else. Like get a good plan in place and go play with your grandkids or whatever. Like, just do something else.
Yeah, it's critical to actually getting out of your own way. Like that's where I see like that idea of behavioral investing is just getting out of your own way. Not getting out of the way of the markets, not getting out of the way of all the bad boogeymen type things that you're thinking about or that your brother-in-law is telling you are going to come from the blogs that he's been reading. It's largely just what you're doing that'll have the biggest impact over your results. So if the idea is get out of your own way, how do you set up your portfolio in the first place where you can actually have something that you sit on for a long enough period of time that you can safely and comfortably get out of your own way? You described this concept of rules-based investing. I'm hoping I'm setting you up appropriately for that concept here, but how do you describe rules-based investing?
Yeah, so rules-based investing is based on this idea. Well, it's based on the research. So in the book, I cite a meta-analysis, which is just, again, fancy word for study of all the studies that have been done on individual decision-making, like expert level individual decisions versus just following simple rules. And what we find is that 96% of the time, simple rules beat human decision-making. And what's important, and this sort of cuts across context, right? This is everything from asset allocation to stock selection to prison recidivism studies to doctors making diagnostic decisions. Like this sort of cuts across. And so the thing that's amazing though is if you follow these simple rules, not only are you going to do better, you're also going to just have less brain damage from thinking about this stuff. Like, I mean, it's not fun. Again, there's better uses of a life than sort of wallowing in the doom and gloom and the daily ups and downs of the market. And so, it's one of these things where you're going to do better and you're going to save yourself a lot of headache and heartache. So yeah, rules-based investing is just what it sounds like having simple rules and sticking with those rules through thick and thin. which is very difficult, right? Like coming up with the rules, there's actually a lot of ways. Like there's a lot of ways to get this right. I introduce, some semi-complex sort of ways to get it right in the book. But I mean, there's very simple ways. There's 2 and 3 fund portfolios that would serve you very well in a rules-based framework that you just got to stick with the rules. And that's the hard part because, exercise daily and don't eat sweets is a rule too, but it's tough to follow.
So maybe that's the $1 million question here, but someone sets up a rules-based portfolio. Here in Canada, we actually have a lot of what we call all-in-one type portfolios that can use some of these. I've often referred to them as factor-based. You use the language of evidence-based or research-based, things like that. You go into that in the book a little bit with your 5 Ps of behavioral investing. But if it's really that hard to do, are there any practical steps that people can take? Maybe working with an advisor is one thing that can help get people pointed in the right direction despite themselves, or what are some other things that you'd recommend?
Yeah, there's really two things that I think you can do. So one is to automate everything, right? So one of the best things, we talked a little bit earlier about sort of positive and negative framing with respect to investor behavior. And one thing we know about human nature is that we're kind of lazy, we're very status quo prone. And sort of once we get in a rut, we like to stay there. And as an investor, that could be problematic, but you can also make it work for you, right? So like being lazy and status quo prone, if you haven't started your investing journey, well, that's a problem. Like you need to get going. But you can also use your innate laziness and status quo proneness to just say, hey, every 2 weeks when I get paid, this much is coming out of my check and it's going to these, 3 funds, however you're set up, right? It's going to my investment account. I'm going to make that correct decision once and I'm going to leave it alone forever. And so what you've done is one of the most simple but powerful things you can do for your financial future, which is just to use that natural laziness to make it easy, right? Because we don't want to have to make the right decision every 2 weeks, right? We don't want to have to reevaluate that and go, am I still saving? Are we still doing this? Like, is this still a good idea? No. Set it in there and lock it. I talk to my kids about this, right? I got a kid who just started high school and it's like, look, you got to decide now that you're not going to do drugs, right? Like, so the time to make an important decision about your life is not when you're at a party and someone's handing you something. It's right now. Like, yeah, this is the decision we're going to do. This is what I'm going to do. This is what I'm not going to do. Make the right decision once and then let gravity kind of work for you. The other thing is what you mentioned, which is working with an advisor. And, this is a question I get all the time in an era where there's lots of target date funds, there's lots of index funds, and it's easy to trade. And like, it's pretty easy from a technical perspective to get what you need, right? For the average person, it's pretty easy to get what you need financially speaking. And yet, we know that people who work with an advisor display a host of improved financial and personal outcomes versus the general population, right? People who work with an advisor do about 2 to 3% better per year than those who don't. 2 to 3% doesn't sound like a huge number, but when you think that a mixed, a diversified portfolio is going to average something like 7% a year, if you're in 60% stocks and 40% bonds, you're going to make something like 7% a year over long periods of time. 3% is a huge chunk. And, we've even seen research out of Canada that shows that people who have a long-term relationship with an advisor have 2.7 times the wealth of their peers who match them on many other levels, right? Like they're educationally similar, they have similar incomes. The people who work with advisors have about, more than 2.5 times as much money 15 years on. And it's because that advisor has kept them from being their own worst enemy. It's not like that advisor necessarily is picking the hottest stocks or anything like that. That advisor is just keeping them from making a handful of catastrophic screw ups that can torpedo your financial future. I'll give a quick example. I have a relative who I don't think listens to Canadian money podcasts. We hope not. No, but I have a relative who is elderly now. Like he was a dentist, professionally, lived outside of LA, had a beautiful home, had a $2.5 million home that was paid for, had $5 million plus in the bank, and began to have medical problems, right? He began to have sort of tremors in his hands, and he could no longer do the work of a dentist. And so he was forced into an early retirement, the way that, sometimes we are sort of forced into an early retirement. But, he's got $8 million net worth. He's doing good. Well, he didn't have an advisor. And so he took that $8 million, he sold his house, liquidated that, took the rest of it, bundled that money, and gave it all to a friend who was doing real estate deals in Las Vegas right before the housing crisis hit. And so he lost all but $50,000, went from $8 million to $50,000 in the course of about 18 months. And now he lives in his child's basement in his golden years, in his silver years. And it's like, there's a million examples like that of one mistake. If he had brought that to an advisor would have shot it down. An advisor would have told him all the reasons it didn't make sense. And that would have been, the advisor's charging whatever, 1% a year, whatever it is in Canada. He would have saved him $8 million, right? So it's these huge turning points like that where an advisor can be so critical. And if an advisor can keep you from making 2 or 3 big mistakes over your lifetime, he or she will have paid for themselves many times over.
Wow. Crazy story. Thanks for sharing that. That is wild. I've seen all sorts of things like that, but never one that extreme.
Yeah.
I took a few excerpts from your book actually on how to find a good advisor, and I recorded a whole podcast about it already. So if people are thinking, well, are all advisors created equal? I would say no. And there are some things that you can look for. Maybe if you have a few things that are top of mind that you could remember that you maybe look for if somebody's looking for an advisor.
Yeah. So this is funny. My wife, who does not work in finance, read my book, and that was her favorite part, which is like, I can't decide whether to be flattered or offended by like my 10 question checklist being the best part of the book. But, she was like, look, if I ever get hit by a truck, like, she's got to go find an advisor. And, how do you separate wheat from chaff? So a couple that I like to talk about is like, first you say, could you explain to me your philosophy of financial planning and investing? Right? And then look for the answer. And there's really 2 things that you're looking for. One is an absence of jargon, right? Like, can they make it simple enough that you can understand it? And 2 is it should be fairly concise. Like, there's a lot of BS that can be couched in complexity. And a lot of times that complexity is expensive. And so, I think a well-considered, concise response to that question is the hallmark of a thoughtful advisor. And that's a very fair question, right? To like, how do you think about markets and planning? The second thing I would ask is, how do you keep me from being my own worst enemy? I just shared some of the research. The research is undeniable that is the best thing that an advisor does for her clients, right? Is to keep them from being their own worst enemy. And so if they are of the mindset that their biggest value is picking stocks or something, that's not the advisor that you want. You want someone who's been thoughtful about how to manage behavior. And then I would ask about fees. And, again, the thing you're looking for here, you're not looking for the lowest fees. Like, you're not looking for sort of bargain basement necessarily, but you want someone who is transparent and thoughtful about their fees and how they get paid. And don't you dare listen. There's people here who will say stuff like, oh, like, this is free and nothing's free. Like, if it's positioned to you as being free, the fees are just hiding. So you want someone who is thoughtful and upfront about the way that they get compensated. They should get compensated, right? Like, there's no shame in advisors getting paid. It's just when there's sort of subterfuge and smoke and mirrors around fees that I think you've got a shady character.
For sure. That's a good thing to keep in mind. I've never had anyone ask me to work for free. They just want to know, right? Mm-hmm. Transparency, like at those stages that you described, is really important. So looking at the clock here, I got to get you out on maybe a last word here. So maybe, do you have any key takeaways that beginner investors will hopefully get from reading any of your content? I've read The Laws of Wealth. You have a couple other books. Maybe you could highlight which ones might be the best place to start from if somebody is new to you and these ideas of behavioral investing. And yeah, I'll leave you with that. What do you recommend?
Yeah, so I was very intentional that the first half of The Laws of Wealth is the thing that I think will be of most use to your audience. And I was very intentional about the ordering of that content. And the first chapter of that section is you control what matters most. And, a lot of times, I'm sure you encounter something similar. When people hear you work in markets, they come to you and go, okay, what's the president going to do? What's the prime minister going to do? What's the virus going to do? What's going to happen in Ukraine? Like, whatever, right? They ask about all, what's the market going to do? They ask about all of these externalities that require a level of prescience that just doesn't exist. And the thought is sort of like, well, if I could just have a crystal ball and if I could sort of see the future, then I could figure this whole thing out. And, one of the points that I make in the book is it doesn't require a crystal ball. It just requires sort of radical responsibility and ownership to say, look, the things that matter most are in my power. Like, have I maximized my human capital? Have I gone to school or gotten the training that I need to get the best job that I can do? Because your job is the engine of your wealth, right? Have I hired a professional to help me with these things? Have I been patient and long-term in my thinking? Like, all of these unsexy things are the things that are predictive of financial success. And it's none of the fortune telling, it's none of the stock picking, and it's none of the externalities. And I think when we can take that power back and say, hey, I can figure this out with the help of a trusted advisor if need be, but like, I can figure this out and I can do this. And I don't have to get lucky or time the market or be a political forecaster. I think that's an empowering message, and I hope one that people take with them. Yeah, in terms of what to read, my book, The Laws of Wealth, is definitely the place to start. I just turned in another book that won't be ready for about a year, but it's called The Soul of Wealth. And it's all about sort of happiness and contentment and money and meaning. And I think that'll be a great read for your listeners when that comes out. So you should be able to pre-order that probably around Canadian Thanksgiving. So,
nice.
So look for that soon, because I think that'll be useful as well.
Awesome. This was a great conversation. I appreciate you taking the time and sharing all the research and your life's work that you've done in this area. If people, besides the books, if people want to find you, where can they find you?
Yeah, I'm on LinkedIn is sort of professionally where I'm most active, Daniel Crosby, PhD. And then, of course, the podcast is called Standard Deviations.
Awesome. Thanks so much for your time, Daniel. Appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Canadian Money Roadmap Podcast. Any rates of return or investments discussed are historical or hypothetical and are intended to be used for educational purposes only. You should always consult with your financial, legal, and tax advisors before making changes to your financial plan. Evan Neufeld is a certified financial planner and registered investment fund advisor. Mutual funds and ETFs are provided by Sterling Mutuals, Inc.